our conversation was very wide-ranging because by now we have touched on a number of things. We got close to the topic when we talked about the mantram. I explained what a mantram is and talked about how it can be a complement to meditation because we can't meditate all day long, but we can always say the mantra. And in the course of time, when we do say the mantra, it reconnects us with the state of mind that we achieved in meditation. And the main thing about that state of mind, well, I actually mentioned three, and they were all kind of useful. The first is, as we kept saying, a reduction in fear. And I will just add now that Gene Sharp and a lot of scholars of civil resistance, they don't like to use the term nonviolence, but civil resistance. Uh, the first step, the sine qua non, that makes it possible for you to resist, is to overcome fear. So that happens very powerfully when we meditate. One of the reasons being we lose a little bit of our body consciousness, and so many of our fears are about injury, sickness, loss of the body, which ultimately goes back to the fear of death. When that goes, you become extremely powerful. So we talked about episodes where people risked their lives voluntarily as the final escalation in the escalation curve, and how incredibly effective that can be. Though sometimes you lose your life, sometimes you don't. We talked about prayer, and I drew the distinction, classic distinction, first of all, between prayer and meditation, saying that in prayer, it's been said that you're speaking to God or asking God something, if it's a petitionary prayer, and in meditation, you're listening to God. You may be using a passage and going through the words in your mind, but what is really happening is you are sensitizing yourself to the awareness that there is a spirit inside you, which you have not been aware of, which is incredibly benevolent, as my teacher said, it's guiding you and protecting you. And it also is a gateway to tremendous powers, among them the persuasive force of principled nonviolence versus the coercive force of strategic nonviolence. So I did point out that for me, the main difference between the two grades or levels of nonviolence, which is quite critical, I talked about it a good bit last time, is the kind of nonviolence that's backed by some kind of spiritual practice is principled nonviolence. And I will add here that I remember a conversation I was privileged to have with Johann Galtung, who said, without some kind of spiritual practice, nonviolence is just a collection of tricks. And he added, the other side usually has better tricks. I was called on my constant use of the word opponent, and I promised to do penance for that. As Gandhi would say, submit myself to the highest penalty that can be afforded in such a case. We ran over the escalation curve again, and I described what those three phases are. And especially, we came back again and again to the question of that criterion. What is that against which you're measuring escalation? And in other words, rehumanization, what does that mean? And I said one simple way to think about it is the empathic awareness of the needs of the other. And that this has a tremendous opening up effect in negotiations, for example, in restorative justice. If you say, well, I needed this, so I did it, you become aware. I told that little story of the boy with the bicycle, stealing somebody's car and giving him a bicycle in return. That for him, the bicycle meant everything, just as for the adult, the car meant everything. So it was an equivalent exchange, even though they were not equivalent in terms of financial worth. When you become aware of the needs of another person, the critical aspect to that is you become aware that their needs are the same as yours. And that itself is a powerful bridge to bridge any sense of alienation or disunity between you. And the second thing that you realize is that on the level of wants, there's quite a bit of disparity between what one person wants or another person wants. But on the level of needs, they can always be satisfied. So there's no irresolvable conflict. So the strategy is to become aware of your own needs and address the needs of the other person, of which he may not even be aware. And then I talked about many cases where if you simply give a person respect, they drop their other needs and conflict is gone. There are even cases, if you look at someone like this psychiatrist who dealt with, murderers basically in prison for 20 years, he found that the one thing that they always needed, the underlying cause of that extremely violent crime, this is Harold Gilligan I'm talking about, was the search for respect. And then, or the desperate attempt to escape having been shamed. And it was just, for every single case, that was the underlying motive. And so we could go on and extrapolate from that, all of which we didn't get into in our conversation. We could extrapolate from that and say that if you have an elevated image of the human being where everybody feels dignified, violence would disappear. So let's make sure that we talk about that next week.